Bravo Delta Show, brought to you by Maruti Cement and Seiko. हेनरी मार्श एक विश्व प्रसिद्ध ब्रिटिश न्यूरोसर्जन र लेखक हुन्। आफ्नो उल्लेखनीय करियरको क्रममा उनले हजारौं जटिल मस्तिष्क शल्यक्रियाहरू सफलतापूर्वक पूरा गरेका छन्, जसका कारण उनको दक्षता र मानवताको लागि विश्वभर प्रशंसा गरिएको छ। हेनरी मार्शले अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय स्तरमा बलियो सम्बन्धहरू निर्माण गरे, जसमा नेपालका सबैभन्दा प्रतिष्ठित मध्येका एक न्यूरोसर्जन स्वर्गीय डाक्टर उपेन्द्र देवकोटासँगको गहिरो व्यावसायिक सम्बन्ध पनि सामेल छ। उनीहरू मिलेर नेपालमा न्यूरोसर्जिकल सेवाहरूको विकासमा ठूलो योगदान दिए। त्यसैगरी मार्शको प्रयास युक्रेनसम्म पनि फैलिएको छ, जहाँ उनले सीमित स्रोत भएका स्थानहरूमा न्यूरोसर्जिकल सुधारमा महत्त्वपूर्ण योगदान प्रदान गरेका छन्। चिकित्सा क्षेत्रमा आफ्नो करियरसँगै मार्श एक बेस्ट सेलर लेखक पनि हुन्। उनका संस्मरणहरू डु नो हार्म, एडमिशन्स र उनको सबैभन्दा पछिल्लो कृति एन्ड फाइनली ले न्यूरोसर्जरी र जीवनका भावनात्मक, नैतिक र व्यक्तिगत चुनौतीहरूको गहिरो दृष्टिकोण प्रस्तुत गरेका छन्। यी कृतिहरूको इमानदारी र गहिराईको लागि विश्वभरका पाठकहरूले प्रशंसा गरेका छन्। आज हामीसँग हुनुहुन्छ उनै हेनरी मार्श। Henry Thomas Marsh, welcome to the Bravo Delta Show.
Thank you.
First of all, in Nepal, a doctor is a doctor is a doctor. Whether you're a physician or a surgeon, but in your resume, you mention yourself as Mr.
There's a rather silly English tradition that once you complete your surgical fellowship exams, which is usually several years after completing medical school, you then revert to being Mr. So I became a doctor when I finished at medical school. Mm-hmm. I became a Mr. 4 years later when I became an accredited surgeon. And the reason for this is historical, that certainly in the Middle Ages, 600 years ago, operations, not that many operations were carried out by barbers, by haircutters, because they had sharp blades. Mm-hmm. And if a patient needed an operation, the real doctors, the physicians, would pay a barber to do the actual mm-hmm. surgery. And then over the centuries, it became a sort of ridiculous tradition. So when you became a surgeon, you went back to being called Mr. This causes great confusion internationally. Mm-hmm. But personally, I prefer to be called doctor. It seems simpler.
And if you look at your background, you never started with medicine.
No, I didn't. I started at Oxford University and studied politics, philosophy, and economics. Mm-hmm. And then for various complicated reasons, I decided I wanted to become a doctor. So I then went to London University and qualified as a doctor at the age of 29. And I then started studying as a neurosurgeon at the age of 31 and became a consultant 6 years later.
So, as a surgeon, always been a neurosurgeon?
Yes. Well, I did 1 year of general surgery mm-hmm. as part of my basic training. But from then on, it was all neurosurgery, yes.
So what pulled you towards neurosurgery?
It was a fairly sudden discovery. When I was already a doctor, I had gone down to an operating theatre to help an anaesthetist prepare a patient for an operation. And the operation was a brain operation on an aneurysm. And I found this operation. I wanted to be a surgeon, but I wasn't quite sure. I hadn't really found something that I felt suited me. And watching this operation, which I felt was like bomb disposal work for cowards, because it's not the surgeon's life at risk. It was very exciting, it was very dangerous, it was done under a microscope, so it involved very delicate fiddling, which I like doing, rather than big sort of incisions and mm-hmm. ripping open people's chests, things like that. So I knew immediately that's what I wanted to do. And it was, to be honest, it was partly because I'd always been fascinated by the brain. I'd always been very, very interested by the neurology when I was a student. But it was the drama, the excitement. It appealed to my love of risk. You know, I'm a bit of a risk seeker, although that has changed over the years with growing maturity. So I knew immediately that's what I wanted to do. And I started training shortly afterwards in neurosurgery. And looking back in it now, 40 years later, I have no regrets, but I would never encourage anybody to become a neurosurgeon.
Why is that?
Because it's often, in human terms, very distressing. You see many terrible illnesses and people you can't help. And sometimes if you make mistakes or things go badly, there can be a tremendous sense of guilt and shame. The problem is the brain does not heal in the way other parts of the body do. So our capacity as doctors to treat people is limited. And every time you operate, there is a risk you might make things worse. And looking back, any neurosurgeon looking back in his career will have many bad memories. There was a famous French general surgeon called Le Riche who wrote that every surgeon carries within himself an inner cemetery, and it's a place to which he has to go sometimes to think about his mistakes. And I'm not unusual, I think, as a retired senior surgeon, that when I look back on my career, I don't remember the successes. All I remember are the patients I feel I failed.
So, what's the balance?
The balance is that you achieve great things sometimes, and you save people's lives, you help them. But of course, the triumphs are only triumphant because of the disasters. If every operation was safe, there'd be nothing very special about being a surgeon, and in particular, being a neurosurgeon. But I've always found the brain fascinating, and I've always loved looking after patients, and I love operating. So I don't regret it for a moment, but I paid a price for it, and I think my family paid a price for it, although I'm very happy with my children now and I have grandchildren. But my second wife says never marry a neurosurgeon because his bad day at work will always be worse than your bad day.
And you mentioned that a brain never heals.
It is very limited. It heals to some extent, but it is limited. It cannot its capacity for rewiring itself. The brain is a mass of electrical connections, 85 billion nerve cells, trillions and trillions of electrical connections between them. And when that is damaged, the capacity of the brain to rewire itself is very limited.
Looking at your life, Doc, from a young boy in Britain, you trained yourself in Britain, and then you've served in different areas of the world. Yeah, you've been in Ukraine for a very long time, and now we meet you in Kathmandu. But there is a common link that every place you go, you see people with neurological issues. Are the issues similar or different?
What I'm interested in is teaching and training. For many surgeons, training the next generation is like a hand and a glove. The two go together, treating the patient and training the next generation. My parents were both humanitarian idealists. They were among the people who founded the organization of Amnesty International. So the idea of trying to be useful internationally was part of my sort of cultural DNA, as well as the actual DNA. I find it that's fascinating to be in a foreign country with an alien culture, and see it slightly from the inside, not as a tourist. And that is a huge privilege, and it's one of the privileges of being a doctor. But I do not come to countries like Nepal or Ukraine or Sudan, where I also worked, to tell people how to do things. That is wrong. would hate to be condescending in any way. I just try to say, here I am, I have my set of knowledge and skills, please make use of me if you can.
But in terms of ailment, the ailments differ from place to
No,
place?
they're the same. I mean, yes, in Nepal you have infectious diseases we don't see in Europe. But although medical systems differ, and although the relationship between doctors and patients differs between different countries, my strong feeling is when we are patients, when we are ill, we are all the same. Whatever the color of our skin, whatever our cultural background, we are anxious, frightened, suffering human beings.
Your life has been quite a roller coaster,
Yes.
right? From humanities students to a medical student to becoming a surgeon. And your life has given you the opportunity to become a writer too.
Yes.
How did writing start?
It started, well, it's a true story. When I'm asked, why did you write your books? I say, because my wife told me to, which is true, because my second wife, whom I met after my first marriage, failed. My first marriage failed partly because of my obsession with neurosurgery to the exclusion of everything else. My second wife is a very well-known English writer and anthropologist called Kate Fox, and she's a brilliant writer. And she would ask me, what were you doing at work shortly after we met? And I would read her parts of my diary, because I've kept a diary for almost every day of my life since the age of 12. And she would say, oh, you write very well. That should be a book. So she sent me to see her literary agent. This is now about 15, 16 years ago. And the literary agent said, yes, you can write, but you need to, if you're going to write a book, you need to structure it. And I then spent about 10 years looking at my diary, taking parts of it out and rearranging.
So the first book was a memoir.
They're all memoirs, in effect. There are three books. They've all been bestsellers. Without wanting to plug myself too much, the first book has been translated, I think, into 38 languages and has sold millions of copies. But they're all memoirs.
Do No Harm was.
Do No Harm was the first one.
And it was even adapted for a film.
Well, there have been 3 documentaries made about me, and there's now a 4th being made by the BBC in Britain at the moment. Yeah.
The English Surgeon?
The English Surgeon's about my work in Ukraine. And that figures in some of my books as well.
Now, talking about Ukraine, it's a fascinating coincidence that you're here. You've been acquainted and worked with Ukraine for a long time. And Ukraine is at war. And the other coincidence is a lot of young people from Nepal have joined the army as a mercenary force.
Yes.
In the both ends.
Yes.
How bad is the war in Ukraine? Is it as bad as the media portrays
yes, it's
it?
Terrible. It's absolutely terrible. I mean, first of all, it is rather as though China invaded Ukraine. I mean, the Russians have no business to invade Ukraine. Putin talks historical rubbish, saying Ukraine is not a real nation. The great majority of Ukrainian people want to be independent and free from Russia. The war is terrible because hundreds of thousands of young men are being killed on both sides, more on the Russian side than the Ukrainian side. There are also endless missile and bomb attacks on the cities. The Kiev, the capital, where I go regularly, has very good anti-aircraft defenses now. So when there are missile attacks, only a few people are killed out of a population of 2 million. But in the east, Ukraine's a very big country, so the front line is about 400, 500 miles away from Kiev. Their entire cities have been completely devastated, like Bakhmut. So it is, and whatever happens, or to reconstruct Ukraine is going to be terribly expensive and difficult. The damage the country has suffered from all the Russian missile attacks is terrible.
The Bravo Delta Show, brought to you by Maruti Cement and Seiko.
Did you get the opportunity to watch Vladimir Putin talking to the American press?
I read about it. Or Scott Tucker Carlson, yes. I read about it, yes. And he espouses this complete nonsense view of history. The way to understand what Putin is doing is it's imperialism. It's Russian imperialism. He is trying to reconstruct the Russian Empire. The Soviet Union was an empire and was a continuation of the Tsarist Empire. It's colonialism, pure and simple.
So do you see the war ending
No.
anytime soon?
No, I don't. Well, of course, what Putin is hoping is that Trump will win in November. And then he hopes that American support, which is blocked at the moment anyway in Congress, will collapse and then Russia will win, whatever that means. If Trump wins in November, it's a catastrophe not just for Ukraine, but for the planet because of his denial of climate change and things like that.
I hope it's not a political view that you're telling me. It's just a humanitarian.
It's a humanitarian view, yeah.
And you even worked in modernization of, the Soviet era.
Yes, and I started working in the 1990s when the healthcare system in post-Soviet Ukraine was terrible and they had very little equipment. And I used to drive from London to Kiev with a carload of second-hand operating microscopes and things like that. That was great fun at the time. So I did my best. I was helping one particular surgeon who then became very successful, but pride comes before fall, and I had to stop working with him eventually because he simply had become too autocratic and would not accept criticism. And we all need to accept criticism. Criticism is the most important. It's very important in trying to make things better.
You enjoy being criticized?
No, I hate it. We all do. We all hate being criticized. But the whole point is, as I give my medical lectures, and I was saying this here, my lectures last week, there's a fundamental rule of human nature, is that other people are better at seeing my mistakes than I am. And all the most successful processes in life involve teamwork and people criticizing and helping each other. The idea of the great, brilliant individual, I think, is on the whole wrong, particularly in surgery, in modern surgery.
So when did you perform your last surgery before you retired?
I can't remember now. I mean, I was still operating before the pandemic, occasionally, not very often. I think the last operation was just before the pandemic in 2019. I was helping. I had retired from my hospital from full-time work, but I then acted as a sort of mentor and guide to one of my trainees who took over my job, and I would help him with difficult operations. He now is doing very well, rather to both my pride and my envy and shame. He's getting some better results than I could have done. As any teacher, ultimately, you want your students to do better than you, but one always views it with mixed
But when you started surgery yourself,
yes,
and the time when you retired, what was the technological advance that you...
Well, ironically, in brain surgery, the technological advance is to make surgery unnecessary. And the big change in neurosurgery during my career was that blood vessel problems in the brain could now be treated by radiological methods with catheters inserted through the blood vessels rather than sawing open a hole in the patient's head, which was wonderful news for patients, but frustrating for surgeons. And now here at Neuro Hospital, they have a very good interventional radiological service. But there's therefore less work for the surgeons to do and more for the X-ray doctors.
Your second book, when did it arrive?
I think the first book was 2014. The second book, I think, was 2017.
How different are the books, 1 and 2?
The first book is purely about my operating and about patients. It's purely clinical stories. The second book is written when I was semi-retired. Quite a lot of it was written here in Professor Devkota's garden, actually. It's a very nice garden. And that's some of its clinical stories, but it's also about my starting to retire and my interests outside purely medical work. And in fact, last year I published a third book called And Finally, which is about becoming a patient with advanced cancer myself and my reflections on that.
When did you meet Professor?
We were trainees together in London in, it would have been 1985, 1986, I think. And we became good friends then.
Friendship between human beings or two neurosurgeons?
No friendship between human beings, although we rather lost contact with each other when he came back here, and we were both very busy with our separate careers. But when I retired from full-time working for the British National Health Service, I was not ready to stop working as a surgeon. So I wrote to him and said, would you like me to come out and help teaching at your hospital? And he said, yes.
So when did that happen?
That was in 2015, I think, if I remember correctly.
Oh,
or maybe 2016. I came out a few months after the earthquake. That was it, 16. And our friendship then was reignited.
I knew him personally myself. He had quite a very far-fetched dream.
Yes.
But unfortunately, he had to leave.
I know. I mean, he died prematurely, and it was great. It was particularly sad. Well, it was terrible, but it was bad for Nepal as well. He had great plans, and he was hoping to get back more, I think, into politics. His doctors here were becoming more self-sufficient and independent. So it was a tragedy all round. Death is always a tragedy. In his case, I think particularly for the people of Nepal.
And you've been coming to Nepal and, being part of the hospital in many ways. How do you rate this hospital? I mean, let's be very honest about this.
The facilities here are as good as what you'd find in a hospital in the West, on the whole. The problems are systemic problems to do with healthcare in Nepal as a whole. And that is obviously because Nepal is a poor country, and it is difficult to afford first world medical care in a country which is fundamentally very poor. The official GDP figures makes Nepal one of the poorest countries in the world, although it's more complicated than that. No, the problem is too many. I mean, in a sense, in Kathmandu, there are too many hospitals providing neurosurgical care. The way you make real progress in medicine is having centers of excellence. And that means large numbers of patients, because medicine is all about experience. And if you fragment your workload, your what we call clinical material, which is a terrible phrase, but if you have many hospitals all doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, it's very difficult to build up really good expertise.
Professional merger of some sort?
Yes, that would be the answer. But then you have the problem of surgical egos and human beings. My lectures now, I went into neurosurgery a very ambitious, egotistic, typical surgeon. My anthropological wife says I am a typical silverback gorilla, alpha male. But what I learned, I left the profession more or less 40 years later, a passionate believer in teamwork. Particularly, as I said, other people are better at seeing my mistakes than I am. But real progress now in healthcare is not really more technology or more money. It's about getting better cooperation between doctors. And that doesn't come naturally to surgeons. And it doesn't come naturally to people in Ukraine and Nepal. There's still a tradition of the big man. And that's what patients want as well. But if you look at how surgery is practiced, certainly in my department in London and in many departments in America, it's increasingly a collaborative exercise, where it is competition, it is cooperation between doctors rather than competition.
And as you said, the hospital or hospitals that we have are at par to any Western hospital.
More or less. Yes.
But it always comes to the affordability of...
Healthcare is terribly expensive. And all countries face a demographic crisis. There are more and more old people in the population. That is because of falling infant mortality. There's been a huge change in infant mortality in countries like Nepal. But fewer children die, there are eventually more and more old people. And most diseases are age-related. I mean, cancer, for instance, by the age of 70, we have 1,000 times greater risk of getting cancer than at the age of 20. And then you have the problems of dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that. So all healthcare systems are in a state of crisis to a certain extent because there are more and more patients who can be treated. And secondly, technological advance means there are more and more things we can do, but they're all very, very expensive. My brother, for instance, is currently being treated for cancer of the esophagus, which was essentially an incurable disease 10, 20 years ago. But he now is having chemotherapy, he probably will have radical surgery, and probably will be cured at the age of 76. But this was inconceivable even 10 years ago. So all this costs more and more money, and the question is, where does that money come from?
But healthcare back in Britain, when you started your career back in the 70s? 70s?
End of 70s, yes.
End of 70s. Has it improved over the years?
It's
as good as
the question is, how do you judge it? What are you judging?
In terms of affordability, if I fall sick, I should be confident a hospital is going to treat me.
There are big problems at the moment in Britain because the Conservative government is not really very sympathetic to the National Health Service. And there are about 100,000 job vacancies, and there are major queues and delays. So there are big problems at the moment. If you have a serious illness, as my brother has, then actually things work very well. But if you go to an accident and emergency department, you'll have to wait for hours. And you may have to wait days before they can find a bed for you. So there are big problems. But they're not unique to Britain. Other public healthcare services are struggling a bit as well.
Today, you very casually switched over to said, I'm a patient myself.
Yes.
Being a doctor for all your life,
yes.
And now you're battling cancer.
Yes.
How do you look at the switchover?
It wasn't that difficult. I mean, my son had a brain tumor when he was very young, before I became a neurosurgeon. So I had some personal experience. There's been quite a lot of disease in the family. So I worked as an operating theatre porter once and as a nursing assistant once before becoming a doctor. So I had some idea of what it was like to be at the bottom of the hierarchy as a patient. So becoming a patient myself didn't hold any great surprises for me. I knew that being a patient is essentially a humiliating, demeaning, frightening, disempowering experience, which many doctors don't understand, particularly young doctors, until they become patients themselves after many years. But what it did remind me of is something I already knew, but it brought home to me just how there is such a vast gulf between doctors and patients. It's a very, very unequal relationship. And that is necessary to some extent. As a doctor, you can become too emotionally involved with your patients, and you need to care for them. You need to be emotionally involved with your patients, but not too much, or the work becomes impossible. So you have to wear sort of blinkers a lot of the time. And particularly in neurosurgery, you see so many terrible human tragedies. The main challenge, I think, is not becoming too detached, too insensitive. And that's very difficult. So that, when I became a patient myself, it just brought home to me, it reminded me what I knew. I think the biggest challenge of medicine is not a technical one. The first big challenge is finding a balance between caring for your patients and being clinically and scientifically detached. And the second big challenge is getting on with your colleagues. The third challenge is the simplest one, which is just the technical side of operating. That's the easy bit. Everything else is difficult.
So your third book came as a patient?
Yes. Yep.
What does it tell the world?
Well, it's about more than just about my having cancer. It tells the world that really the lesson I learnt, as most of us learn, I think, as we start to reach the end of our lives, is that what matters in life when you look back is what did you do to help make the world a better place? What did you do to help? There are many ways of making the world a better place than just being a doctor. Doctors are fortunate. It's a sort of moral luxury being a doctor. But what really matters at the end is your family, the people you love. And I would extend that, not that I'm a Buddhist, really to all living things. Mm-hmm. Whereas your material possessions, your worldly success, you cannot take them to the grave with you. They may seem very important when you're younger, but in retrospect, you realize these things aren't important. What matters is your relationship with living things. You could call it love by another name.
Being a doctor, being a patient, fighting an ailment, the ultimate truth is what you just mentioned, that,
Yes.
The end of life.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on death?
Well, I don't think there's any life after death. As a neuroscientist, I have to accept that our brains are physical systems which obey the laws of physics. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about that, of course, is that the laws of physics tell us nothing about how physical matter gives rise to conscious feeling, both in animals and in ourselves. We just don't know. This does not mean I think there's some mysterious essence separate from our brains, but we do not understand how our brains work. Even though we know lots of facts and scientific details, the really big questions, like how do nerve cells produce feeling and conscious experience? And even how do nerve cells produce intelligence? I'm very, very skeptical about all this talk about artificial intelligence being smarter than we are, when we don't even begin to understand what makes us smart.
But you've seen the end of life,
yes,
very closely, and you've differed some end of lives.
Well, there are many ways of dying. Some are, you can die quickly, you can die slowly, you can die painfully, you can die painlessly. There's many. We're all the same when we're dead, but how we get there is very variable. In many countries now, but not including England, legislation allows what is called assisted dying, that the doctors can help somebody die if that is their considered wish, provided it comes with sufficient legal safeguards. I think that is a sign of a civilized society. We don't have it in Britain, but in England, is coming in Scotland quite soon. But I hope to see that be introduced legally. But some countries are not ready for it.
But some are, right?
Some are, yes.
In Switzerland.
Oh, yeah, Switzerland, Holland, Spain, many American states, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, many countries now have this. It's only a very small number of people who want it, but it's small but significant.
How would you justify ethics attached to such decisions?
Because I see the role of a doctor is to reduce suffering. It's not just to keep life going at any cost. What medicine is about is reducing suffering. Often that means you're trying to prolong the patient's life. But sometimes, by prolonging the patient's life, actually you're increasing suffering. And again, in modern medicine, we're having to make decisions like this all the time. When do you stop ventilating a patient? When do you stop intensive care? So it happens already, in effect.
But still, when is the right time to take a...
Well, that is up to... It is our right as autonomous individuals. I mean, suicide is not against the law. So you have to say, why is it against the law?
If you live, it is.
Well, it's not against the law in England.
Are you...
No, it's not illegal. It might be here. But I mean, suicide is not illegal. So in England, you have the paradox. Why is it illegal to help somebody do something which is not illegal? So it has to, they're complicated arguments, but I have no problem with it personally. But it does need to be properly run. And again, we have evidence now. You can look at the many countries where assisted dying is permitted, and there is no evidence this is leading to abuse or exploitation or anything like that. You have legal safeguards. It's perfectly safe.
Now, before we end, it's a very globalized world. I can meet you here, and I could meet you in Ukraine.
Yes, yes.
And there is quite an exodus of Nepalese professionals.
Yes, I know.
Going abroad and performing their duties.
Yep.
Do you see any formula that is available to keep at least half of it
Well, it's
in the country?
It's very difficult. This is a result of globalization. I find it very, very sad teaching and talking to young Nepali doctors here who do not really see their future in Nepal. And there are two reasons for that. One is, and the same applies to nurses as well, and the big problems of nursing there. They all go abroad. They're paid much more by the other countries, and you cannot stop that. You cannot change that. And that reflects the fundamental economic inequalities in the world. But you can potentially try to improve their employment prospects back here. I mean, that is a problem for Nepal to solve. I don't know the answer. But you need to look carefully.
But you feel that urge of...
Oh, yes. And it's not unique.
Leaving
it's not unique to Nepal. I mean, in Ukraine, another country I work in regularly, Albania, there's a huge shortage of doctors. All the doctors are going to Germany. And the German hospitals and medical services are providing German language lessons, and so it's a big problem. Big problem.
So, doctor, anything that you dream about your friend's dream?
Well, I hope the hospital prospers and copes with a changing world. And there's been a big change in the workload in the hospital, and there's more and more work with stroke. There's less surgery. My dream really for Nepal is a day when there is better cooperation and more centralization. But that's very difficult because of an impoverished government sector and relatively flourishing private sector. So I see no easy solutions. But all I know is ever since I first came here, I say in my second book, I say, is it possible to fall in love with a country? And I did in many ways in Nepal, not as a tourist just loving the mountains, but there is something unique about Nepali culture. I'm not idealizing it. You had a terrible civil war. There are many terrible bad aspects to life here, but it is a unique culture and a very, very special culture for all the historical reasons. And I love the country, and I hope it flourishes in a very, very difficult world.
Well, thank you very much for your very honest and very candid thoughts about the country. And we wish to see you more and more in Nepal, and wish neurosurgeons benefit from your presence. And we wish you a very good health.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.